Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda Fay in for Jerry Anderson this morning. Well, the midterm elections are now behind us, but results are still coming in for some races that could impact the makeup of Congress for the next 2 years. My first guest this morning, Dr. Sam Nelson, Associate Professor of Political Science for the University of Toledo. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. You were with us on election night. We know a little bit more now, not a whole lot. Things are still kind of a toss-up situation. We don't exactly know where the Senate's going or the House, but kind of get us up to speed here.
So I think that, yeah, some results are going to take another week or two to come in. The runoff in the Senate race in Georgia isn't until next month, 3-4 weeks from now. So final control is up for grabs. If, as it looks like now, Republicans have control in the House, it's going to be narrow. Very difficult for them to manage, and Democrats still have a very good chance of keeping control of the Senate.
Okay, because right now we're looking, it's neck and neck. And as you mentioned, that race in Georgia is coming down to a runoff once again.
Right. And that's going to be really interesting. It's going to depend a lot on what happens with the Arizona and Nevada Senate races. That'll change the dynamic. If former President Trump declares that he's a candidate for 24, that's going to change the dynamic down in Georgia. He's a big backer of Herschel Walker, the candidate down there. So there's a lot to watch down there. A lot of money already flowing down there. All of these volunteers and staffers from campaigns that just ended flooding into Georgia on both sides to work on that campaign.
So a lot of focus will be right there on Georgia, as we have seen in the past. Speaking of former President Trump, we could expect some sort of announcement here in the coming days. Not quite sure yet, but he got out and started supporting a number of candidates here ahead of the midterms. One of them here in our neck of the woods, J.D. Vance, who did win, but did he win by a large majority here, or what are we talking, what are we looking at with some of those candidates that he supported?
So it was a pretty bad night for Donald Trump, and that's the narrative I think that's coming out. Both Democrats and Republicans are pointing to that, as well as journalists and others. J.D. Vance is really the only prominent big ticket candidate that he backed that won. And then let's look at how J.D. Vance won. He won by 6 points when Governor DeWine won by over 20. Statewide races for Republicans in Ohio, they were winning by like 60-40 was the typical number for the auditor, the attorney general, and so on. And then Vance was back at 53, underperforming. Now, part of that is a testament to Tim Ryan running a really strong campaign, being a special kind of candidate, but some of that is the association with Trump. And then we see Herschel Walker in Georgia in a runoff. You know, maybe a different Republican without that attachment to Trump would have already won that race and not needed a runoff. If you look at different House candidates in toss-up races where Trump endorsed somebody, there were 5 of the main toss-up races. All 5 of those lost. So right now, Republicans are thinking, how do we get away from this? He's pulling us down. J.D. Vance, he still wins. He's still a senator. The margin doesn't matter that much to him, but it certainly matters to observers trying to figure out what's the Trump effect on our electoral prospects.
Sure, sure. And when we look at the congressional race here, Marcy Kaptur and Jared Majewski, he obviously lost, but we're talking about in a new district that had just been redrawn that was actually supposed to be more conservative leading. What do you make of that?
Right. I mean, to be honest, that Kaptur won by more than I thought she would. I thought she might lose that race because nobody knew, right? It was a new district and there was no polling. But that was a pretty big margin. She ended up winning by a healthy amount. And I think Majewski was clearly identified with Trump. That really helped him in some of those new parts of the district where Trump is very popular. But, you know, turnout in Toledo and in Lucas County more generally probably really helped her and may have been part an anti-Trump vote as much as it was a pro-Marcy Kaptur vote.
Ah, okay, interesting. And let's talk a little bit about some of the issues, too, that voters had before them. In Michigan, Proposal 3 passed, and that was regarding abortion rights and securing that in the state's constitution. And when we look at Ohio, not exactly an issue there, but as we see, the voters really went kind of right to life direction there. So do you think that issues really brought people out for this midterm?
I do think that, I think abortion was a big issue in a lot of states, and you're right, in Ohio it doesn't seem that Nan Whaley tried to make it a big issue and it didn't really land, but it wasn't directly on the ballot like it was in Michigan, where you were going to vote yes or no, and some other states, even in Kentucky, it was directly on the ballot. So I think that was important. It was important in driving youth turnout, I think, where there's a lot of attention on that, driving women voters who hadn't voted maybe in the past. Some new voters came in. Obviously, inflation was another issue that people cared about, and that one cut against Democrats and against President Biden. Democracy, though, was a big issue. Joe Biden, gave a couple of speeches in the last month elevating democracy as an issue in this election. A lot of commentators were like, oh, voters don't care about that. They only care about the price of gas. But it looks like they did care about democracy when we look at election deniers in a number of races around the country lost. I think that more people were voting on that issue than maybe was expected ahead of time.
Any big surprises for you?
Well, definitely the small margins for Republicans, right? I mean,
it's supposed to be this big red wave, right?
Right. I mean, if you look at President Obama, his first midterm lost over 50 seats. President Clinton in '94 lost, 64 seats, something like that. Wipeouts, just wipeouts. There were 31 House Democrats who retired or didn't run for re-election. That's usually a sign that your party expects, well, we're going to get killed, in this one, right? So I'm not going to run. And that's not what happened, right? Even if Republicans take control of the House, as it looks likely, it's a small margin. It's way underperforming. I mean, the average midterm result is the president's party loses 26 seats. This, Republicans aren't picking up anything like that number.
Do you think maybe if you looked at any exit polling on younger voters, you mentioned them a little bit, did they have anything to do maybe with a way that, did they come out?
Yeah, younger voters turned out and they voted very strongly for Democratic candidates. It was something like 28 points in favor of Democrats over Republicans, voters under 30. So first Gen Z member of Congress was elected, Max Frost in Florida. And I think issues like student loan forgiveness, which is a bit controversial policy of the Biden administration, but I'm thinking it's less controversial with young people with large student loan debt. Abortion rights really going to be important to younger voters who are, in the prime of might get pregnant, and so on. So I might not be a strong attachment to the Democratic Party as a party. They might not be enthusiastic about some Democratic officials, but they turned out and they voted strongly for Democrats, whereas older voters were voting more strongly for Republicans.
Okay, well, some interesting things to chew on here in the days after the election, and then we're going to be looking ahead to, when this does finally settle and we do finally know who is in charge where, we're going to be looking ahead to where they're going to go next. So stay with us. Coming up here in just a couple minutes, we're going to take a look at what we might be looking at as far as leadership and what Congress may have on the docket here soon ahead. Stay with us. Welcome back, Dr. Sam Nelson, Associate Professor of Political Science for the University of Toledo, joining me again here this morning. Dr. Nelson, we were just talking about the makeup of Congress as we wait for these results to come in, and it's looking likely, we're going to have this runoff, so we're not going to know here for quite some time, at least in Georgia, with that Senate race. It is looking like Republicans will gain control of the House, but really by a slim margin. And right now, Congressman Kevin McCarthy has the minority leader position, but is he a shoo-in to become Speaker of the House?
I don't think he's a shoo-in, but they're going to make him pay for it.
Okay.
His own caucus. I think that there's going to be a lot of maneuvering, and I don't see anybody else who can put together the 218 votes and so on and become Speaker other than him. But I think there are a lot of reluctant supporters of Kevin McCarthy. That's going to put him in a very weak position, make it very difficult for him to manage that caucus.
Yeah, speaking of that, I mean, because of that slim majority there, are we looking at getting anything accomplished here? in the couple of years ahead?
I think it's going to be very difficult in terms of legislatively. I think that Republicans are going to be reluctant to give Joe Biden any bipartisan policy victories, right, to run on in 24 if he's the candidate. But there are some things where there are broad areas of agreement. If you look in the last 2 years, the infrastructure bill, there were a lot of Republicans in the House that wanted that infrastructure bill. The CHIPS Act, right, brought a bunch of money into Ohio, right, for those new Intel plants. Those are things that are popular with at least some Republicans and a lot of Democrats. And so there are possibilities, but it's very difficult politically when you don't want, you know, the other side to win.
Right, and so you might just be dragging your feet a little bit or making things a little more difficult than they need to be, right?
Trying to extract some concessions, some deal making. Well,
yes.
How about you give us this tax cut that we want, or you know, make some changes to Affordable Care Act subsidies, or you know, something else that we want. There's also the possibility of a big crisis coming with the debt ceiling. Sometime this spring, we're going to hit the debt ceiling. It needs to be raised, and Joe Biden's going to need Republican votes to get that done. And Kevin McCarthy a few weeks ago was kind of promising to make that a very difficult situation for the president. Now with his majority, if he has it, not being very large, he may not be able to play hardball in quite the way he had hoped to.
Gotcha. Okay, well, any guesses on what some of the issues they could be tackling first?
Well, I mean, we talked during the campaign a lot about inflation and crime. If Republicans have some proposals there to try to address those problems, I think that there'd be meaningful discussions to have around that. Things will come up that we don't know about yet. You know, at some point, probably the president will ask for more funding for Ukraine. And so I would expect to see, you know, a big debate about that. I think that we're still looking at talking about dealing with some of the things like student loan forgiveness that's now in the courts and coming back to Congress. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of things surrounding things like investigations and oversight and
into families. Like Okay, so it's going to be interesting for sure, and something we're going to be obviously keeping a close eye on as these races continue to come in over the next week. And then, of course, we'll be all eyes on Georgia here for that runoff coming up. Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for joining us this morning, bringing your expertise. We appreciate it.